Hello there. If you're here watching this video, there's probably been a time or two where you've read an MCAT passage and just said, "Oh, this passage, it's so nasty," and you just want to criticize it and tear it apart. Well, this lesson is your chance. This lesson is going to get you better at a bunch of different things that are all related to critique of studies and conclusions. The first two things you're going to learn here are about samples and populations. First, defining them, then making conclusions or generalizations about them. We're then going to move to the bigger picture, trying to find true associations between variables, which sounds kind of hoity-toity, but really it's just what science is all about. You want to find things that are related to each other, that move up together or move down together. And we're also going to see some brief notes about ethical considerations in MCAT questions. The context in which we'll see these learning goals are in the subjects of psychological disorders and emotion. We'll be seeing a few studies, and these are the two topics that those studies will focus on. Our main focus, though, remember, is going to be on the design of the experiments that are in those passages. So now we're going to look at two exercises. The first about samples and populations, and the second about the legitimacy of scientific conclusions based on a passage. On the page here in your book, you'll see 5 different excerpts from passages that describe certain parts of studies. And we will identify one by one whether the italicized portion of that excerpt is a sample or a population. But before we even answer those, let's define the terms briefly. A population is a large set of individuals that you're trying to make conclusions about. Generally, that's what makes scientific conclusions useful, when you can apply them to large groups of people or other organisms. But because you usually can't do a study on an entire population, you have to do studies on a sample, which of course we hope is large enough and representative enough, and we'll see a little bit about those criteria later. But for now, let's just identify sample versus population. So let's look at this first one. In this first excerpt, is the italicized portion referencing a sample or a population? Here it's referencing a sample. Whenever you have study participants, by definition, that is the sample that the researchers are going to be using to make a larger generalization. In fact, this is about as close to the definition of a sample as you can get. Let's look at the second one. Is the italicized portion in this prompt a sample or a population? This one is a little bit harder than the last one, but it's about population. Because we see that researchers design a study to determine something. And this causal link they're trying to determine is about urban communities. They're hoping to walk away from this study that they design, whatever that is, by saying, in general, urban communities act this way or are this way. And when you're talking about the group that is going to comprise your conclusion, that's almost always going to be a population. Let's look at the third prompt. Is the italicized phrase here a sample or a population? Here, it's a sample. The italicized portion specifically calls out that they are randomly selected individuals. That is, again, a hallmark of study design. We don't get details about this full study, but the researchers probably want to make a conclusion about these religious communities, and so they're randomly selecting a sample from those communities. Now let's look at the fourth one. Is the italicized portion here representing a sample or a population? This one is probably the most challenging one yet, but it is a population. We're told right here in the excerpt that it's the group that the conclusion is made for. Individuals with borderline personality disorder is a large group of people. The researchers are making the conclusion about this group of people, but in order to put together the evidence for this conclusion, they must have drawn from a smaller sample. But that's not what's being highlighted in this excerpt. It is the conclusion group, and therefore the population. Let's finish up this exercise with one where you figure out the answers. For this excerpt, write down in your book what is the study sample and what's the population. This excerpt describes a study where a group of students are asked to do something. But we're also told the purpose of the study, that the study itself was about universal emotions. So therefore, the sample was the group of students that was participating in the study, and the population, though, is everyone. They're called universal emotions for a reason. And that's the end of this quick exercise about samples and populations. While you may not run into a question on your MCAT that calls out samples and populations, it's really important that you know these topics deep down. because the difference between these two terms drives much of the higher level thinking that you will have to do about studies that you will be asked directly about. Let's see some of those questions now. You've got a passage excerpt on this page, which is an intro paragraph and then one experiment. Read those two paragraphs and jot down quick labels for them now. This passage is about the monoamine theory of depression. The first paragraph outlines that theory in the first place. MAOIs, or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, they might be able to treat depression. Since monoamine oxidase breaks down monoamines, then inhibiting the oxidase will mean you have more monoamines. And for some people, having more monoamines, like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, means their depression is relieved. Then we get this experiment. And as you read this experiment, you might have scratched your head at a few aspects of it. And the reason for that is because we're going to explore some of the things that might have been wrong with this experiment. But first, the outline of the experiment itself. Researchers are trying to see what changing monoamines does to healthy persons. Researchers, they picked 10 patients, pretty small number to make for a study, but we'll go with it. Researchers told the participants which group they were in, and then we hear what actually happened. The experimental groups had their monoamines levels raised, and the final conclusion was that this increased concentration did not significantly impact their mood. So a good label for this paragraph is that they did a study and there was no significant impact. You may have also noted down in your outline that there were some problems with this. And if you didn't notice any problems in this experiment, well, that's what this lesson is all about, because we're going to highlight some of them. Question number 1 calls them out. It says this experiment suffers from several flaws. And then it says which of the following is not one of these reasons. And what we're going to see here is 4 answer choices, each of which is a potential flaw in a study that you may see in real life or on test day. Choice A is temporal ambiguity, or what's sometimes referred to as temporality. The point of temporality is that if you're studying one thing's effect on another thing, you have an independent variable on a dependent variable, then that intervention, the independent variable, has to occur before the dependent variable. Now that may seem obvious, but some studies actually get this wrong. And we have seen that the real MCAT will highlight these studies sometimes. The thing is, in this study, temporal ambiguity is not actually a problem. The intervention, the raising of the monoamine levels in experiment 1, occurred before they recorded the move in their journal. So choice A is actually going to be correct. But let's use choices B, C, and D to highlight what these terms mean, because you may run into any of them on the exam. Choice B is wrong because this study definitely could suffer from selection bias. We hear the researchers hand-picked 10 patients. There's a reason why you hear so much about randomly selected patients and randomized controlled trials in the world of science, and that's because random selection is so important. If you are selecting people for any particular reason, we don't know why the researchers selected these people, but if they hand-picked them, then it's going to be very easy for those selections to be biased in some way. Anytime you don't have random selection, then a study could have selection bias. This study is one of those, so choice B is wrong. Choice C is wrong because what the Hawthorne effect is the fact that when you watch people, sometimes their behavior changes. These patients were not just told that they were in a study, but they were told what the study was for. So it's not too much of a leap of logic that since the patients knew they were in a study about depression, they thought differently about depression and their mood than they would have otherwise. That's what the Hawthorne effect is all about. These patients were aware they were being observed, so maybe they behaved differently. This study could easily be subject to the Hawthorne effect. And then lastly, choice D is wrong because this study was not blinded at all. We saw from the passage that patients knew which group they were in. They knew whether they were getting their monoamines raised or not. And blinding is really important for good study design because otherwise you subject yourself to a stronger placebo effect. If patients know they're in the experimental group, they're getting some kind of intervention, then any changes they report may be just because they psych themselves into thinking that they have some kind of effect. They'd have that effect whether the intervention worked or not. So for a study to be properly blinded, the participants need to not know which group they're in. In fact, ideally, a study is double blind, meaning neither the patients nor the experimenters know who's in what group. Well, anyway, yes, the choice here is A, but what we learn from this question is some key terms about flaws in studies. Question 2 asks us to contribute to a conclusion. Specifically, it says, to which of these groups could you apply the conclusion of experiment 1? Now, interesting, this question, just like the Kaplan tip says at the bottom of the page, that even though question 1 highlighted the negatives in this study, question 2 is highlighting potential positives. It says right in the question stem, assume this conclusion is proven. Don't think about the flaws anymore. Just look at the study and answer the question that number 2 asks, which is to which group could we apply these findings? Now, this is a clever way that the MCAT is asking who would be an appropriate population to make conclusions on based on the sample of this study. See? Samples and populations. So given what you know about samples and populations, and looking back at the passage if you need to, which of these choices is correct? So let's walk through this step by step. We're trying to apply the conclusion of the study to a group. The passage says the conclusion is that the increased concentrations didn't significantly impact mood in healthy individuals. So the sample of this study, that it's healthy individuals. So any population we're going to make a conclusion about also has to be healthy individuals. That means the choice has to be C. People who are misdiagnosed with depression, they're actually the only group out of these 4 answer choices that we would describe as healthy individuals by the terms of this experiment. And choice C would be a particularly good population because it's healthy individuals who nevertheless take MAO inhibitors. These people in answer choice C, even though they're healthy, will take MAO inhibitors, have their monoamines levels raised, and so it's good that this study told us what would happen in those people. The people in choice C would be going through the same situation as the people in this study, so the conclusion would apply to them. In the second half of this lesson, you're going to get better at these 2 things. First, using certain aspects of a study, and the aspects we're going to see are causality, plausibility, and alternative explanations. We'll define all of those in context in a moment. We're going to use aspects of a study to determine how likely that variables are actually associated in the study, which is a fancy way of saying whether they have good conclusions, whether they tell us something about the real world, whether an independent variable will actually affect a dependent variable. And then we're also going to see a question that dips our toe into research ethics. The research ethics that may come up on your exam are beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. And this, honestly, is not something the MCAT tests terribly often, but it is something a test maker will sneak in there. So we're going to see a question that frames how ethics might be tested. On this page, you see experiment 2, and this is essentially an extension of the passage that was started in the previous learning goal. You'll also see above this experiment in the book the same background paragraph that you saw previously about depression and MAO inhibitors. This is just a second experiment that you might see related with that background. So take 1 minute to read through this experiment and make a label for it before we look at the questions associated with it. So this study introduces something called Brunner syndrome, which is related to the MAOA gene. And it's okay if you've never heard of this gene before, because the next sentence tells you what that gene does. Individuals with the condition, they have heightened monoamine levels, and so therefore they're a lot more aggressive than normal individuals. We then get the description of the experiment itself. This time it's an experiment with mice instead of people. We see with the experiment that the researchers had the hypothesis that norepinephrine was responsible for this increased aggression. What they did was they knocked out the MAOA gene in these mice, and in fact these mice were more fearful and more aggressive when they got threatened. Then the intervention on the experiment was an administration of parachlorophenylalanine, or PCPA. That abbreviation isn't given here in the passage, but it is a common abbreviation for this compound. PCPA inhibits serotonin synthesis, and then the researchers found a conclusion. They said that serotonin concentration, not norepinephrine concentration, as they hypothesized, was to blame for the aggressive behavior. This is a good label for this paragraph. It shows us the original hypothesis was about norepinephrine. The experiment itself was explained, the knockout mice, and then we gave them PCPA, and then the conclusion. Now this study, just like the last one, does have some issues we could raise against it, but let's see what the questions associated with this will bring up. This first question for this passage, question 3, is going to focus on causality. This is one of the very basic things every study needs to get right. A study needs to be designed so that the independent variable could plausibly affect the dependent variable. Otherwise, any connection you try to make between those variables might be just coincidence. One aspect of causality is temporality or temporal ambiguity, which we saw a little bit back in question 1, but we're going to see a more general case here. First, try to answer this using your logic. Take a little longer than you usually would on a normal question if you need to. Read through this question, pick an answer, and then we'll go over it. This question introduces a new neurotransmitter. It says that dopamine levels were also mentioned when this PCPA was administered, and that those dopamine levels were low. They were similar to baseline levels. They weren't elevated like we had seen earlier on with the norepinephrine and the serotonin. We're then asked for an appropriate conclusion, and if we assess the answer choices here, we can see that the answer choices here are all pretty similar in structure. Answer choice A says that the dopamine levels are likely to contribute. B says it's not likely to contribute. C says we're not sure, may or may not contribute. And then D is also about contribution of dopamine, but in a more complicated situation. So after assessing the answer choices, we can see this question is really asking, does dopamine influence or not based on this information in the question stem? So let's review what the study itself said. These mice started at a level of high aggression and then were later found to have the decreased behavioral aggression. This question stem tells us that once the mice had gotten the PCPA and were at the low aggression, they also had normal levels of dopamine. But, and this is key, that's the only measure of dopamine that we got. There's no evidence here that dopamine was at any other level at any other time. It could have been higher, it could have been lower, it could have been the same throughout, and so there's not enough evidence here to make a really good conclusion. If we're trying to correlate two variables, namely aggression and dopamine, then we need to know if there is any change in both of those variables in order to try to correlate them. If, for instance, dopamine was higher earlier when aggression was higher, then that's evidence that it contributes to aggression. But if it's lower earlier, then probably dopamine didn't have anything to do with it because the aggression moved independent of dopamine. This is exactly the kind of question the MCAT might present to you in introducing new information into a study. And based on all this, C needs to be correct. We simply have not seen enough to conclude whether dopamine makes a big difference here. We just didn't measure enough. So the takeaway here, what you can take into test day, is that the exam will test causality in this way. The details of the measurements, what gets measured, at what time, whether certain levels of chemicals or interventions can affect other things, the details of these measurements will matter, especially when you get that whiff of a Skill 3 question like this. Now let's look at the second aspect of this study and its conclusions. Question number 4 tells us that the answer choices are 4 external conditions, 4 things that were happening outside of the experiment proper while the experiment was happening. And all 4 of these conditions correlated with the aggressive and fearful behavior of the mice. But what this question is asking us is which one is most likely to be a true relationship between variables. In other words, which one of these is a plausible connection that may have actually influenced the aggressive level of the mice. This is an important aspect of a study to look at because if there is another plausible explanation, a plausible change in external conditions that correlates with a certain variable, then we consider that a confounding variable. It brings any conclusions of the study into question because maybe the change in aggression was due to this other external condition rather than to the monoamine levels. So with that, look through the answer choices and pick the one you think is a plausible causative relationship with the aggressive and fearful behavior. Now we saw this question asks for some external condition that might have caused this change in behavior. So we should look for an answer that is something that is relevant perhaps to mouse behavior. And the correct answer here is D. If the technician who handles the mice was a different person just when those monoamines concentrations changed and the aggression changed, then the aggression might not have been due to the monoamines. Maybe this new technician was unfamiliar to the mice or kind of rough with the mice or somehow treated them differently. That is the absolute definition of a confounding variable. All of the other answer choices, especially when compared to choice D, are not plausible connections to mouse behavior. Choice A is about a study in a neighboring lab, and the mice probably don't know what's going on down the street if they're there in the cages in their lab all day. Choice B is too far away from the mouse's experience as well. It's about the chairs in the lab of the lobby. And choice C is also definitely outside the scope. If we see high measures of aggression that happen during waxing moon phases, that's just a coincidence. The mice in the lab are going to spend their entire lives indoors in artificial lighting and aren't going to be connected to the phases of the moon at all. The MCAT is a test about a lot of things, but it's not about moon phases or astrology or how we or any species might behave during different phases of the moon. Being able to tell the difference between plausible and implausible causative relationships is a key skill for questions like this on the MCAT and also in analyzing studies in your own life, your schooling, and your future career. If this is one of the first times you've really ever had to flex these muscles, then you should be glad for this opportunity to get started. Let's check out now the last question associated with this experiment, which is about finding alternative explanations, or in other words, different reasons why an event or a phenomenon might have happened. It's very similar to plausibility in that way. Go ahead and do question 5 on your own right now, read it, find an answer, and then we'll go over it. So what this question asks for is a flaw in the researcher's reasoning. And as you might have guessed from the header here, that flaw is going to involve possible alternative explanations that they've overlooked. But let's see which one that is. First, to rebrief ourselves on the researcher's reasoning. What they concluded was that serotonin concentration was to blame for this aggressive behavior. They also took their original hypothesis and threw it out the door. They thought maybe it was norepinephrine, but they changed their mind after they saw the results. But they shouldn't have been so hasty in making that conclusion. Let's review what happened in this study again. We started with a level of high aggression and then moved to low aggression after PCPA. And it's fair to assume that there were high levels of serotonin to start with because those were measured, and then low levels of serotonin after PCPA because we're told that PCPA is an inhibitor of serotonin. However, we don't get any information on what happened to norepinephrine. We know levels are high when they started with because that information is in the passage, but norepinephrine is never actually measured at the end of the study. So these researchers were careless not to actually test out their original hypothesis and measure the new levels of norepinephrine. In fact, it is very similar to the issue with question number 3, where in that question you couldn't make conclusions about dopamine because you didn't have both tent poles to measure it by. Here, you can't make conclusions about norepinephrine without both tent poles to measure it by. This matches with choice C. The study and its results just didn't give us enough evidence to reject that hypothesis, even though that's what they did. They knew because of the PCPA that serotonin did lower when aggression lowered, but they just don't know about norepinephrine. That might have lowered too, which would have been consistent with their hypothesis, meaning they shouldn't have rejected it. They just can't know. And that is in fact a flaw in this study and in the researchers' reasoning. The wrong answers here are also interesting because they're wrong for some pretty interesting critical thinking and reasoning ways. Choices A and B are both outside the scope of the researcher's reasoning altogether. Even if serotonin has other effects, or if male mice and female mice reacted differently from each other, those two threads don't interact with the researcher's reasoning at all. They didn't make any promises about sexual differences in mice. And this experiment is controlled just to the aggression in Brunner syndrome. And then choice D is wrong. It's interesting as well. First of all, it is false in the world because monoamine concentrations have been linked to mood. That's where the monoamine hypothesis comes from. But also the lack of support from other studies doesn't necessarily mean researchers would be wrong, even if this were the case. In fact, if a whole bunch of people find one result and then another group of researchers finds a different result, that's an interesting scientific question. Doesn't necessarily mean that second group was wrong. And that brings us to the largest single takeaway from this lesson, which is summarized in the Kaplan tip at the bottom of your page. Don't always just take studies at face value. The MCAT is just as likely to add new conditions or new information to a study or to ask you what's wrong with the study as it's stated. In order to be prepared for the MCAT and for your future in medical school and as a clinician, you need to develop a habit of looking for these aspects of these studies that might call into question or even bolster the results of the studies. Before we completely close up this lesson, let's do number 6. It shows us how the MCAT might test research ethics, specifically in this case, beneficence. In other words, that when you conduct a study, you need to do it in such a way that it gives the best overall potential benefit to all involved, including people in the future who might take some kind of drug that you're researching. With that in mind, give number 6 a try. Read it, answer it based on what you know from research ethics, especially if you've done the preview work and read about this in other materials of yours already. Get to an answer, and then we'll go over it. So this question takes the subject of the passage, Brunner's syndrome, and brings it in a new direction. It says there's a 2-year study on Brunner's syndrome about a new drug, but after 1 year, the drug is great. Good news! The drug is dramatically more effective. So what do these researchers have to do? Well, one thing we know about research is that before you start a study, you need to assume treatments are equal. You need to blind them properly and then see if one has more effect. That's a basic tenet of the scientific method. But, and this is where ethics come in, once you have evidence that one treatment is better than another, it starts to get unethical to take that distant stance. This is a concept called equipoise. And what it means is that these researchers should do choice A. If they know the drug is good, then that second group in the study, who they were giving a placebo, they need to give them the drug too. Otherwise, it's this weird situation where there's a drug, you know it works, but you're consciously lying to a group of people, telling them they're getting the drug when they're not. There are other aspects of research ethics as well. Equipoise is just one type of it, but this is a good example of how equipoise or other research topics might get tested on the exam. So in review, remember back in the first learning goal, we saw the difference between samples and populations. Samples of a population are the selection on which we make an experiment, but the population is the one we're trying to make conclusions toward. And that conclusion is much better supported if the sample is large and representative of the population. We then saw some flaws in experimental design. We considered temporality, plausibility, and alternative explanations as potential aspects of a study that could cast doubt on a conclusion, but there are many more as well. We saw earlier on in the lesson about a few of these: random assignment, selection bias, blinding, Hawthorne effect, and so on. But all of these other criteria are important to look for as well. And if you're unfamiliar with any of these terms, you should use your related resources to get familiar with them. By expanding your vocabulary of looking at studies and critiquing them, you'll make yourself an all-around smarter reader of experiments on the MCAT and beyond. And that's the end of this lesson. Next time you read an experiment, remember, don't just take it at face value. There may be some flaws, there may be some additional conclusions, and it might get you some points on the MCAT. Good luck.